county code enforcement officer stood in David Rodriguez's driveway at 7:43 a.m. on a crisp October morning, clipboard in hand and authority radiating from his pressed uniform. "Sir, I need to inspect your property for unauthorized construction. We've received reports of illegal pond installation without proper permits." Behind him, Sarah Chen crossed her arms with the satisfied smile of someone who'd finally cornered her prey. As president of the Willowbrook HOA, she'd been waiting 9 months for this moment, the public humiliation of the man who'd dared challenge her authority in front of the entire neighborhood. "What reports?" David asked, steam rising from his coffee mug in the 42-degree morning air. "Anonymous tip about unpermitted water features," the officer replied, consulting his paperwork. "The complaint states you've constructed a retention pond without county approval or environmental impact assessment." Sarah's smile widened. She'd crafted that anonymous report herself, spending hours detailing every technical violation she could imagine. David Rodriguez might have fooled their neighbors with his helpful engineer act, but she knew the truth. He was just another rule-breaking homeowner who thought regulations didn't apply to him. "I see," David said calmly, setting down his mug. "And you are?" "Officer Martinez, Environmental Code Enforcement Division." "Which department?" "County Public Works, Engineering Section." David nodded slowly. "Martinez, ... You're new, aren't you? Started about 6 months ago." The officer's confidence flickered. "How did you? Because I signed off on your hiring paperwork," David said, pulling out his wallet. "I'm David Rodriguez, Senior Environmental Engineer, Stormwater Management Division. I've been with the county for 15 years. Martinez's face went pale as he examined David's county ID badge. Sarah's triumphant expression crumbled like a sandcastle in a tsunami. "Sir, I didn't realize..." "Of course you didn't," David said, his voice remaining steady despite the fury building behind his eyes. "But you should also know that every structure on this property, including the decorative pond system, was permitted through proper channels. Permit numbers 2020 4SW 7789 through 7792, approved last spring." Sarah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. This wasn't possible. She'd spent hours on the county website, searching for any permits tied to David's address. She'd found nothing. "Furthermore," David continued, his gaze shifting to Sarah, "the pond you're calling illegal is actually an overflow feature for the $180,000 stormwater management system your HOA hired me to design and install last year." The color drained from Sarah's face. The system that had solved their flooding problems. The system that had earned her praise from homeowners who'd been dealing with water damage for 3 years. The system she'd taken credit for in the newsletter. Martinez fumbled with his radio. "Dispatch, this is Martinez. I need to verify some permit information with the engineering department." "Don't bother," David said. "I can call my office directly." He pulled out his phone, speed dialing a number. "Janet, it's David. I need you to email permit verification for 2024 7789 through 7000 7792 2... He glanced at Martinez's badge. "Officer Martinez, badge number 4471. Yes, the Rodriguez property on Maple Grove. Thanks." Within 90 seconds, Martinez's phone buzzed with the email. His face grew redder with each line he read. "Sir, I apologize for the confusion. These permits are all valid and properly filed. The pond system is approved for both decorative and functional stormwater management purposes." Sarah finally found her voice. "But I checked the county website. Did you?" David's tone remained level, but his eyes had gone cold. "Or did you just assume that because you wanted something to be true, it was true?" The truth was simpler and more embarrassing than Sarah could admit. She'd searched for permits under pond and water feature, but hadn't thought to look under stormwater management or drainage infrastructure. Her own ignorance had become the foundation of her attack. "This is ridiculous," Sarah sputtered. "Even if you have permits, the HOA covenant clearly states that infrastructure improvements designed to prevent flooding take precedence over aesthetic restrictions," David interrupted. "Section 4.7, subsection. See, I helped write that amendment 2 years ago when your predecessor was dealing with the same drainage issues." Martinez began backing toward his vehicle. "Sir, again, I apologize for the early morning visit." The complaint has been marked as unfounded. Wait, David said. Officer Martinez, I need to know who filed this complaint. The report was anonymous. Sir David's gaze locked on Sarah. Anonymous? How convenient. Sarah's face flushed. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, David said. I'm stating facts. Someone filed a false report about illegal construction. Someone who clearly didn't bother to verify the information before wasting county resources. Someone who was so eager to cause problems that they didn't care about the truth. Martinez cleared his throat. Sir, filing false reports is a misdemeanor offense. If you'd like to press charges, I'll consider it, David said. Never breaking eye contact with Sarah. The HOA president's bravado finally cracked. David, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, he replied. Just consequences. Martinez drove away. Sarah stood alone in David's driveway, her carefully constructed plan in ruins. She'd wanted to humiliate him, to prove that his expertise meant nothing against her authority. Instead, she'd exposed herself as petty, vindictive, and incompetent. But this confrontation was just the visible tip of a much deeper conflict, one that had been building since the day David Rodriguez moved into Willowbrook and dared to challenge the way things had always been done. The real story began 9 months earlier, in the freezing rain of January 2024, when a simple act of professional courtesy had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose the rot at the heart of their suburban paradise. January 15th, 2024, 3 days of continuous rain. The water had been rising for hours when David first knocked on Sarah Chen's door. He'd moved into the Willowbrook subdivision just 2 weeks earlier, drawn by the mature trees and well-maintained homes that seemed to promise the peaceful suburban life he'd been seeking after his divorce. What he hadn't expected was to watch his new neighbor's basements flood, while the HOA president insisted everything was under control. Mrs. Chen, David had said when she answered the door, her face tight with stress. I'm David Rodriguez, new resident at 247 Maple Grove. I wanted to offer my help with the drainage situation. Sarah's first instinct had been suspicion. In her 5 years as HOA president, she'd dealt with plenty of new residents who thought they could waltz in and fix everything. I appreciate the offer, but we have professionals handling it. I'm sure you do, David had replied patiently. But I'm a stormwater engineer with the county. I've been doing this for 15 years. I might be able to suggest some immediate solutions while you wait for your contractors. That had been the moment when Sarah should have swallowed her pride and accepted help. Instead, she'd seen David's expertise as a threat to her authority. If the new guy could solve problems she couldn't, what did that say about her leadership? We'll manage, she'd said curtly, closing the door in his face. But the water kept rising. By that evening, 12 homes had basement flooding. The HOA's emergency contractor was overwhelmed, and Sarah was fielding angry calls from residents who'd lost furniture, electronics, and family heirlooms to the murky water that seemed to appear faster than it could be pumped out. David had tried twice more to offer assistance, each time meeting with Sarah's increasingly hostile rebuffs. Finally, he'd gone directly to the affected homeowners, spending his own weekend analyzing drainage patterns and identifying the fundamental design flaws that made flooding inevitable during heavy rains. His informal assessment had been damning. The subdivision's drainage system was inadequate, poorly maintained, and violated several county stormwater management guidelines that had been updated since the original construction in 1987. The solutions were relatively straightforward and could have been implemented years earlier. If anyone had bothered to consult with county engineers about the recurring problems, when David presented his findings to the emergency HOA meeting on January 18th, the room had erupted in frustrated questions that Sarah couldn't answer. Why hadn't they hired a proper engineer years ago? Why were they paying thousands in emergency fees when preventive solutions existed? Why hadn't their HOA president, who claimed to have everything under control, actually controlled anything? That night, Sarah Chen learned that expertise commanded respect in ways that elected authority never could, and she hated every minute of it. The homeowners had voted unanimously to hire David as a consulting engineer, overruling Sarah's objections about unnecessary expenses and outside interference. Within a week, He'd produced a comprehensive assessment that identified not just the immediate drainage problems, but systemic issues that would require extensive infrastructure improvements. The price tag was staggering: $180,000 for a complete stormwater management overhaul. But David's presentation had been so thorough, his credentials so impeccable, and the alternative, continued flooding and property damage, so unacceptable, that the HOA board had approved the project by a 4-to-1 margin. Sarah had cast the lone, dissenting vote, not because she disagreed with the technical assessment, but because accepting David's solution meant acknowledging that her 5 years of leadership had been fundamentally inadequate. The winter project had been a spectacular success. By spring, the new drainage system was preventing flood damage that would have cost individual homeowners tens of thousands of dollars. David's retention pond system was so effective that it actually improved property values throughout the subdivision. Neighbors praised his work. The county cited Willowbrook as a model for private stormwater management. Sarah's own basement, which had flooded 3 times in previous years, stayed completely dry during the spring rains. But instead of gratitude, Sarah felt only resentment. Every compliment about David's engineering felt like criticism of her leadership. Every successful storm that passed without flooding seemed to highlight her. Previous failures, she'd begun looking for ways to reassert her authority, starting with increasingly aggressive enforcement of minor HOA violations. David's grass was half an inch too tall. His mailbox had a small rust spot that violated community standards. Each violation notice was technically correct, but petty to the point of harassment. David had initially responded with good-natured compliance, assuming Sarah was simply being thorough. But as the notices multiplied through the spring and summer, he'd begun to understand that this wasn't about community standards, it was personal. The breaking point had come in August, when Sarah had issued a violation notice for unauthorized landscape modifications after David had planted native wildflowers in his backyard. The plants were specifically recommended by the county for stormwater management and were explicitly allowed under HOA guidelines he'd helped write. That's when David had realized Sarah wasn't just incompetent, she was vindictive. And vindictive. People with authority were dangerous. His decision to build the decorative pond had been both practical and symbolic. The pond would serve as an overflow feature for the existing stormwater system, providing additional flood protection during extreme weather events. But it would also be beautiful, valuable, and completely legal, a permanent reminder that expertise and proper permits trumped petty authority. David had filed all the necessary paperwork, paid the required fees, and followed every county regulation to the letter. He'd even included the pond in his annual HOA architectural review, noting its functional and aesthetic benefits. Sarah had approved it without comment, apparently not understanding what she was signing. But when the pond was completed in September, its elegant design and obvious quality had drawn admiring comments from neighbors who'd already been praising David's engineering work. The pond became another symbol of his competence and her inadequacy. That's when Sarah had decided to destroy him. Her anonymous complaint to the county had been carefully crafted to suggest serious legal violations. She'd claimed David had constructed unpermitted water features that violated environmental regulations and posed potential safety hazards to the community. She'd implied that he'd used his position as HOA consultant to circumvent proper oversight. Every allegation had been false. But Sarah had counted on the county's bureaucracy to create problems even for baseless complaints. At minimum, David would face embarrassing questions from his own colleagues. At best, he might face actual legal consequences that would finally put him in his place. What Sarah hadn't counted on was that David Rodriguez wasn't just another homeowner who could be bullied into submission. He was a 15-year county employee with an impeccable reputation and a detailed understanding of exactly how stormwater management systems worked. More importantly, he was a man who'd spent his entire career dealing with people who thought regulations didn't apply to them. He recognized petty tyranny when he saw it, and he had no intention of tolerating it. Standing in his driveway that October morning, watching Sarah's face crumble as her plan backfired spectacularly, David felt a familiar mix of disappointment and determination. Disappointment that it had come to this. determination to make sure it never happened again, because this wasn't just about a pond or a drainage system or even an HOA president's wounded pride. This was about the fundamental question of whether expertise and truth mattered more than authority and politics. And David Rodriguez had spent too many years watching floods destroy homes and lives to let petty people create artificial disasters. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. 2 hours later, the neighborhood grapevine word of the morning's disaster spread through Willowbrook, faster than water, through David's carefully engineered drainage system. By 10 a.m., half the neighborhood knew that Sarah Chen had called county code enforcement on the man who'd designed their flood protection system. By noon, everyone knew that David Rodriguez wasn't just a helpful neighbor, he was a senior county engineer who'd been doing them a favor. The reactions ranged from embarrassment to fury, but the underlying sentiment was universal. Their HOA, the president, had made them all look like fools. Margaret Patterson, whose basement had flooded 3 times before David's intervention, was the first to call for Sarah's resignation. She tried to destroy the man who saved our homes, Margaret told anyone who'd listen. What kind of leader does that? Tom Bradley, the HOA treasurer, was more direct. Sarah's pride nearly cost us our relationship with the county. If David decides to stop helping us, we're back to flooding every spring. But the most damaging reaction came from the county itself. By 2 p.m., David's phone was ringing with calls from colleagues who'd heard about the morning's incident. The story was spreading through the county government like wildfire. One of their senior engineers had been investigated by his own department because of a vindictive HOA president. "David," said Janet Morrison, the county's chief engineer, "I need to ask, are you comfortable continuing to work on private projects in your subdivision? Because if this woman is going to keep filing false complaints, it creates a conflict of interest for the county." David understood the implication. His professional relationship with Willowbrook could be severed by Sarah's actions, leaving the residents without their most knowledgeable advocate for drainage issues. "I'll handle it," he assured Janet. "This won't happen again." But privately, David was considering options that went far beyond HOA politics. Filing a false report with government agencies was a crime. Harassment based on professional retaliation could be a civil matter. And if Sarah's actions had jeopardized his standing with the county, there might be grounds for a defamation lawsuit. Meanwhile, Sarah was discovering that her authority had evaporated overnight. The HOA board members who'd previously deferred to her judgment were now questioning every decision she'd made. Homeowners who'd once respected her leadership were demanding explanations for her attack on David. Her attempted damage control only made things worse. In a frantic email to the community, Sarah had tried to frame her actions as due diligence and proper oversight of community standards, but everyone knew the truth. She'd filed a false report because she couldn't stand being shown up by someone who actually knew what he was doing. The email had backfired spectacularly, with residents responding with increasingly angry messages about abuse of authority and waste of tax dollars. Several homeowners had already called for an emergency board meeting to discuss Sarah's removal. By evening, David's phone was ringing with calls from neighbors who wanted to apologize for their president's behavior. The conversations were awkward, but revealing many residents had noticed Sarah's escalating harassment campaign but hadn't known how to intervene. "We should have said something," admitted Carol Martinez, who lived 2 houses down. "Everyone could see she was targeting you with those ridiculous violation notices. But she's been HOA president for so long, we just assumed she knew what she was doing." David appreciated the apologies, but he was thinking about bigger issues than neighborly relations. Sarah's false report had revealed systemic problems that went beyond personal animosity. How had an HOA president been able to file anonymous complaints about a county employee without any verification? Why hadn't there been safeguards to prevent harassment through official channels? More troubling, what if Sarah's target had been a different resident, someone without David's professional credentials and governmental connections? How many other homeowners had been bullied into submission by HOA officials who abused their authority? These questions would shape David's response to the crisis. He wasn't just dealing with a vindictive neighbor. He was confronting a system that enabled petty tyrants to damage people's lives with impunity. The next morning brought news that would accelerate David's decision-making process. Sarah Chen had filed a complaint with the county's ethics board, alleging that David had used his government position to circumvent proper oversight of his private construction project. The complaint was as false as her original report, but it represented a dangerous escalation. Sarah was now attacking David's professional reputation directly, potentially jeopardizing his career and pension. After 15 years of public service, David's colleagues were outraged. His supervisor, Mike Thompson, called the complaint malicious and completely without merit. But David knew that even baseless ethics complaints could create problems for government employees, especially if they became public. That afternoon, David made 2 phone calls that would define his response to Sarah's campaign of harassment. The first was to Amanda Sullivan, an attorney who specialized in civil rights and governmental liability cases. David wanted to understand his legal options for dealing with Sarah's false reports and their potential impact on his career. Amanda said after reviewing the facts, "You have multiple potential claims here. Filing false reports with government agencies is a crime, and if her actions have damaged your professional reputation, that's potentially defamation. But what I'm really interested in," she continued, "is the systemic issue. How is it possible for an HOA president to file anonymous complaints about a county employee without any verification process?" The second call was to Janet Morrison, his supervisor. At the county, "David, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. Sarah Chen has made it clear that she's willing to abuse official channels to pursue personal vendettas. I won't put the county in a position where our employee is being harassed through our own enforcement mechanisms." Janet was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from us? And I need you to document everything that's happened here, because I'm going to pursue legal action against both Sarah Chen and the H. "David, I understand your frustration, but this isn't about frustration," David interrupted. "This is about accountability. Sarah Chen filed false reports, wasted county resources, and potentially damaged my professional reputation. She needs to face consequences, or she'll do it again to someone else." That evening, David drafted his resignation letter from the HOA board, but Sarah's actions had made his position untenable. The letter was brief and professional, but its implications were devastating for Willowbrook, their liaison with county engineering, and their most effective problem solver. His resignation would leave the community vulnerable to exactly the kind of flooding problems that had plagued them before his arrival. More importantly, his resignation letter included a paragraph that would haunt Sarah Chen for years to come. While I regret leaving the board during ongoing drainage projects. Recent events have made my position untenable. The filing of false reports about my private property, followed by baseless ethics complaints about my professional conduct, has created a conflict of interest that I cannot ignore. I will be pursuing appropriate legal remedies to address these matters and to prevent similar harassment of other county employees. The letter was delivered to every household in Willowbrook the next morning, along with copies of the permits for David's pond and documentation of Sarah's false complaints. David wanted every resident to understand exactly what their HOA president had done and why their most valuable board member was resigning. The community's reaction was swift and decisive. By evening, more than 80% of homeowners had signed it. Sarah Chen's reign of petty tyranny was over, but the damage she'd caused to David's reputation, to the community's relationship with the county, and to the principle that expertise should be valued over authority would take much longer to repair. As David sat in his backyard that evening, watching the sunset reflect off his perfectly legal pond, he reflected on the lessons of the past year. He'd moved to Willowbrook, seeking peace and community. Instead, he'd found a microcosm of everything wrong with unchecked authority and personal vendetta, but he'd also discovered something more. Hopeful, when people were confronted with the truth about abuse of power, they usually did the right thing. The residents of Willowbrook had ultimately chosen expertise over politics, facts over fiction, and accountability over loyalty. It was a small victory in a world full of Sarah Chens, but it was a victory nonetheless. The pond system continued to function perfectly, preventing flood damage that would have cost the community hundreds of thousands of dollars. David's engineering expertise had literally saved his neighbors' homes and property values. Sarah Chen's legacy would be remembered very differently, as a cautionary tale about what happens when personal pride becomes more important than community service, and when authority is used as a weapon Rather than a tool for problem solving, 3 months later, David received a letter from the county attorney's office. Sarah Chen had been charged with filing false reports and harassment. The HOA had voted to remove her from the presidency and was considering legal action to recover the costs of her misconduct. David felt no satisfaction in Sarah's downfall. He'd never wanted to destroy her, he'd simply wanted to solve drainage problems and live peacefully in his new home. But sometimes, holding people accountable for their actions was the only way to prevent them from harming others. The new HOA president, elected by an overwhelming margin, was Margaret Patterson, whose basement had been saved by David's engineering work. Her first official act was to formally apologize to David on behalf of the community and to ask, expertise without authority was often more effective than authority without expertise. The pond remained his favorite feature of the property. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of the principle that truth and competence would ultimately prevail over politics and pettiness, at least in Willowbrook. Anyway, the real test would come the next spring when the first major storms would reveal whether the lessons of the past year had been learned by everyone or whether new conflicts would emerge from the endless. He'd built his reputation on solving problems, and he'd learned that sometimes the biggest problems weren't technical. They were human, but humans, unlike drainage systems, always had the capacity to change course when confronted with the consequences of their actions. Even Sarah Chen, wherever she was now, had hopefully learned that expertise deserved respect, that authority came with responsibilities, and that filing false reports was a crime that carried real penalties. The pond continued to function flawlessly, protecting the community from floods and serving as a monument to the principle that good engineering, like good character, was built. Talasta and David Rodriguez, senior environmental engineer and reluctant neighborhood hero, continued to sleep well at night, knowing that he'd done the right thing even when it was difficult. Justice, like proper drainage, required careful planning and persistent effort.